If you look at the raw specifications of the aircraft that won the Second World War, you usually find machines of exceptional performance. The P-51 Mustang had range and speed. The F-4U Corsair had raw, brutal power. But the aircraft that arguably delivered the single most decisive blow in the history of naval warfare possessed none of these traits. It was a 1930s design, underpowered, structurally heavy, and painfully slow. In level flight, it was a sitting duck for any modern fighter plane. Yet, in the span of exactly 5 minutes, on the morning of June 4, 1942, this obsolete piece of aluminum broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy forever. Today, we are analyzing the Douglas SBD Dauntless, affectionately and grimly known by its crews as slow but deadly. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the logistics, and the hardware that shaped military history. Before we get into the weeds of carrier doctrine and radial engines, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite underdog weapon system of the Second World War? We have a lot of ground to cover, so let us get straight into the strategic chessboard that made the Battle of Midway inevitable. To understand why the United States Navy was relying on a slow dive bomber to save the Pacific Fleet, we have to rewind the clock to the end of the First World War. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the subsequent London Naval Treaty of 1930 placed strict tonnage limits on capital ships. Battleships were the undisputed kings of the sea, heavily armoured fortresses that projected national power. The treaties capped their numbers to prevent a ruinous arms race. However, there was a massive loophole regarding a new, unproven type of vessel called the aircraft carrier. Navies were allowed to convert unfinished battleship and battlecruiser hulls into flat tops. The United States converted the Lexington and the Saratoga. The Japanese converted the Akagi and the Kaga. At the time, admirals viewed these ships as mere scouts, mobile platforms to find the enemy fleet, so the battleships could blow them out of the water. But the aviation pioneers in both nations recognized a fundamental shift in the geometry of naval warfare. Why close to 20 miles to fire a 2,000-pound artillery shell when you can send an airplane 200 miles to drop a 1,000-pound bomb? The problem was accuracy. Horizontal bombing from high altitudes, the kind championed by the Army Air Corps with their B-17 flying fortresses, was statistically useless against a moving warship. A destroyer or a cruiser traveling at 30 knots can turn inside the time it takes for a bomb to fall from 20,000 feet. If you wanted to kill a ship, you had to deliver the ordnance with sniper-like precision. The solution was born not in a laboratory, but in the jungles of Haiti and Nicaragua in the 1920s. United States Marine Corps pilots, flying flimsy biplanes, realized that if they pointed the nose of their aircraft directly at the target and released the bomb, while diving, accuracy improved dramatically. They were essentially using the entire airplane as a bomb site. The Navy watched this improvised close air support and realized its potential for ship killing. They needed a dedicated machine built specifically for the violent physics of diving straight down at the ocean. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was developing its own doctrine. Japan was an island nation with limited natural resources, driven by an expansionist policy to secure oil and rubber in Southeast Asia. Their strategic doctrine, known as Kantai Kessen, or the decisive battle, envisioned luring the American Pacific Fleet across the ocean, whittling it down with submarines and night torpedo attacks, and finally destroying it in a massive battleship duel. But the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, knew that the American industrial base would eventually overwhelm Japan. He needed to knock the United States out of the war quickly. Pearl Harbor neutralized the American battleships, but it missed the carriers. By early 1942, Yamamoto realized that as long as the American flat tops existed, Japan's defensive perimeter was vulnerable. He devised a complex, overly elaborate trap to draw the remaining American carriers out and destroy them at a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. How do you defeat an enemy that outflies you, outshoots you, and has been fighting in combat for half a decade, while you were still trying to shake off the Great Depression? The answer is a combination of signals intelligence and ruthless logistics. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, cracked the Japanese naval code known as JN-25B. They discovered the target of Yamamoto's next offensive was designated AF. Through a brilliant deception involving a fake radio message about a broken water distillation plant, Rochefort confirmed that AF was indeed Midway. This gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, a priceless advantage. Nimitz was a gambler with ice water in his veins. He knew he was outnumbered. The Japanese were bringing 4 heavy carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, forming the Kido Butai, the most lethal naval striking force on the planet. Nimitz had only 2 operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. This brings us to one of the greatest logistical miracles in military history. A third American carrier, the USS Yorktown, had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks prior. Japanese intelligence assumed she was resting on the bottom of the ocean. When the crippled Yorktown limped into dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor, naval engineers estimated it would take 3 months to repair her. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. This is the American industrial machine in a microcosm. 3 shifts a day, thousands of workers swarming the ship, welding steel plates while the dry dock was still draining, and continuing to repair her electrical systems as she steamed back out of the channel. The Yorktown was patched, armed, and sent to a rendezvous point 300 miles northeast of Midway, known as Point Luck. We can compare Nimitz's setup at Midway to General George Meade's positioning at the Battle of Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, Meade occupied the high ground in a fishhook formation which gave him interior lines of communication. He could move reinforcements quickly across the center of his lines to meet Confederate attacks on the perimeter. Nimitz did the exact same thing on a strategic scale. By knowing Yamamoto's objective, Nimitz placed his 3 carriers on the flank of the Japanese advance. He gave himself interior lines of intelligence and positioning. Yamamoto, maintaining radio silence and unaware that his codes were broken, was marching blindly into an ambush. But having the tactical advantage on paper means nothing if you do not have the hardware to deliver the killing blow. Let us look at the weapon the Americans brought to the fight. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was designed by the legendary aeronautical engineer Ed Heinemann. By 1942 standards, its specifications were utterly underwhelming. It was powered by a Wright R1820-32 Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine, producing 1,000 horsepower. It had a maximum speed of a blistering 250 miles per hour and a cruising speed of just 185 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter could comfortably cruise at over 200 miles per hour and hit top speeds of 330 miles per hour. If a Zero caught a Dauntless in level flight, it was a slaughter. But the Dauntless was not built for level flight. It was built to survive a vertical plunge and carry a heavy payload. Unlike the Japanese aircraft, which sacrificed armor for speed and maneuverability, the Dauntless was built like a flying tank. It featured self-sealing fuel tanks that would swell and close bullet holes, preventing catastrophic fires. It had 1,200 pounds of armor plating, protecting the pilot and the rear gunner. A Dauntless could absorb multiple hits from the 7mm machine guns of a Japanese Zero and keep flying. Its armament consisted of 2 forward-firing .50 caliber Browning machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, and a flexible twin-point 30 caliber mount in the rear for the radioman to fend off pursuing fighters. But the most critical engineering feature of the Dauntless was its dive flaps. When an aircraft weighing over 6,000 pounds points its nose straight down at the Earth, gravity takes over. Without intervention, the plane will rapidly accelerate past its structural limits, reaching terminal velocities over 400 miles per hour. At that speed, the flight controls lock up, and pulling out of the dive will literally rip the wings off the fuselage. Heinemann solved this by designing perforated dive flaps, essentially massive air brakes with 3-inch holes punched through them, often referred to as Swiss cheese flaps. When deployed, these flaps prevented tail buffeting and held the aircraft at a steady, manageable 276 miles per hour in a 70-degree dive. This gave the pilot the stability required to look through his telescopic sight and drop a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb exactly on the red circle painted on a Japanese flight deck. The Japanese equivalent was the Aichi D3A, codenamed the Val by the Allies. The Val had fixed landing gear and looked somewhat like a German Stuka. It was highly maneuverable, so much so that it could occasionally dogfight with American fighters. However, the Val carried a lighter payload, typically a 550-pound bomb, and it had 0 armor protection for its crew. This reflected the broader doctrinal differences between the two navies. The Japanese emphasized overwhelming offensive power and extreme range at the cost of survivability. Their pilots were the product of the Yorktown training program, a brutally selective and rigorous system that produced the finest naval aviators in the world. By 1942, these men were veterans with hundreds of combat hours over China and Pearl Harbor. In contrast, the American V-5 training program was designed for mass production. The United States understood the grim mathematics of a war of attrition. American pilots were generally greener and less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, but there were thousands of them in the pipeline. The Japanese relied on an artisanal approach to warfare, forging a magnificent but brittle sword. The Americans relied on an industrial approach, forging a massive heavy hammer. And on the morning of June 4th, that hammer was loaded into the bomb racks of the Dauntless squadrons aboard the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. We can look back at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 for a perfect historical parallel. At Agincourt, the English longbow, a relatively simple weapon wielded by commoners, rendered the heavily armoured elite French knight completely obsolete in a single afternoon of mud and blood. The longbow shifted the paradigm of medieval warfare. The dive bomber did the exact thing to the battleship. The era of the big gun, of dreadnoughts slugging it out in line-ahead formation, was over. It was replaced by 1,000 pounds of high explosives falling from the sky. But delivering those explosives required navigating a chaotic, uncoordinated American strike plan that nearly ended in total disaster. Japanese doctrine dictated a massive, perfectly coordinated strike package. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts were all supposed to arrive over the enemy fleet at the exact same moment, overwhelming the anti-aircraft defenses. The American doctrine aimed for the same thing, but in practice it was a disorganized mess. The American carriers launched their squadrons using a flawed point option system, and once in the air, the different squadrons lost contact with each other. The torpedo bombers went in low. The fighters got lost. The dive bombers climbed high into the freezing oxygen-starved altitudes above 15,000 feet. As the sun rose higher over the Pacific, the Dauntless squadrons, led by men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, stared down at an empty ocean. Their fuel gauges were steadily dropping toward the red line. They were flying on a heading where naval intelligence said the Japanese fleet should be, but there was nothing but endless blue water. The entire battle, and perhaps the entire war in the Pacific, hinged on a single decision made in a freezing cockpit miles above the sea. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky looked at his fuel gauges and did the grim mental math that every aviator dreads. The needle was hovering near the red line, and his 2 squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise were burning through precious aviation gasoline with every minute they spent, searching empty ocean. The Wright R-AT 1820 radial engines were reliable, but they were thirsty, and at an altitude of 15,000 feet, the air temperature was well below freezing. The cockpits of the SBDs were unheated. Pilots and gunners shivered in their heavy leather flight jackets, oxygen masks strapped to their faces, scanning the vast, monotonous expanse of the Pacific. Doctrine dictated that McClusky should turn back, conserve his fuel, and ensure his air group lived to fight another day. But McClusky was a former fighter pilot, a man wired for aggression. Looking down through the scattered clouds, he spotted a lone white streak on the blue canvas of the sea. It was the wake of a ship steaming at high speed. This vessel was the Japanese destroyer Arashi. It had been left behind by the main Japanese fleet to depth charge an American submarine, the USS Nautilus, which had dared to infiltrate the Japanese formation earlier that morning. Having kept the submarine pinned down, the Arashi was now racing at flank speed to catch up with the Kido Butai. McClusky made a decision that altered the course of the 20th century. He banked his formation and followed the destroyer's wake, like an arrow pointing straight to the heart of the Japanese Navy. Would you risk ditching 32 aircraft and their crews in the middle of the ocean on a hunch? Or would you play it safe and retreat? McClusky bet everything on that white line of foam. To understand the sheer violence of what was about to happen, we must dissect the mechanics of a dive-bombing run. It is not simply a matter of pointing the nose at the ground and pressing a button. It is a highly technical, physically punishing maneuver that requires absolute precision under extreme duress. When a Dauntless pilot spotted his target, he would roll the aircraft onto its back or perform a steep wing-over, pulling the nose down into a punishing 70-degree angle. Immediately, the pilot would throw the lever to deploy the perforated dive flaps. Without these flaps, the aerodynamic drag of the SBD was so low that it would accelerate past 400 miles per hour, stripping the fabric off the control surfaces and ripping the wings from the fuselage. With the flaps deployed, the aircraft stabilized at a deafening, shuddering 276 miles per hour. Inside the cockpit, the pilot leaned forward, peering through the Mark 8 telescopic gunsight tube mounted ahead of the windshield. The target, a Japanese aircraft carrier, dodging and weaving at 30 knots, would fill the glass. Wind screamed through the gaps in the canopy. Anti-aircraft fire, ranging from heavy multi-purpose guns to rapid-fire 25mm cannons, would erupt from the sea below, creating a funnel of black flak bursts and glowing tracer rounds. Flying into this was like riding a roller coaster into a blast furnace. We can compare this specific type of aerial assault to Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, or the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. It was a frontal assault against fortified positions, but executed in 3 dimensions at hundreds of miles per hour. As the altimeter unwound with terrifying speed, dropping from 15,000 feet to 2,000 feet, in a matter of seconds, the pilot had to make constant micro-adjustments to the rudder and ailerons to keep the red dot of the gun sight centered on the wooden flight deck below. Then came the critical mechanical sequence. A 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb was slung beneath the belly of the Dauntless. If the pilot simply released it in a steep dive, the bomb would fall straight through the spinning arc of the propeller, destroying the aircraft instantly. To prevent this, American engineers designed a heavy tubular metal crutch called a displacement gear, often referred to as the trapeze. When the pilot pulled the manual release handle, the trapeze violently swung the massive bomb downward and outward, clearing the propeller arc before releasing it into freefall. Once the payload was gone, the pilot had to immediately grab the stick with both hands and pull back with immense physical force to recover from the dive. This violent pullout generated between 5 and 6 units of gravitational force, or Gs. The blood would drain from the pilot's brain, pooling in his legs. Vision would narrow into a tunnel, colors fading to grey, a physiological phenomenon known as a grey out. In the rear seat, the radioman gunner had it even worse. Riding backward, he was slammed into his seat, completely blind to the horizon, trying to keep his twin 30-caliber machine guns pointed at the sky in case enemy fighters pounced on them during the vulnerable recovery phase. It was a brutal, mechanical ballet, and at 10:22 a.m., on June 4, 1942, the curtain went up over the Japanese fleet. To understand why the Japanese carriers were completely defenseless from the sky at that exact moment, we have to look at the tragic sacrifice of the American torpedo bomber squadrons that arrived just prior to the dive bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew the Douglas TBD Devastator. The Devastator was a hopelessly obsolete aircraft, a slow, lumbering target that had to drop to 50 feet above the water and fly a straight, predictable line at barely 100 miles per hour to drop its Mark 13 torpedo. When Waldron and the other torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and Yorktown attacked, they were intercepted by the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. Over 50 Mitsubishi Zero fighters swarmed the Devastators. The slaughter was absolute. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo 8, all 15 were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived by clinging to a seat cushion in the water. Torpedo 6 and Torpedo 3 suffered similarly catastrophic losses. Not a single American torpedo found its mark. It was a tactical failure of monumental proportions. But in the ruthless calculus of war, this massacre achieved something miraculous. By flying low to the deck to massacre the American torpedo planes, the Japanese Zeros had pulled themselves out of position. They had burned their altitude, expended their ammunition, and were skimming the waves. The sky above the Japanese carriers, from 10,000 to 15,000 feet, was completely empty. Was this a coordinated masterstroke of American tactical doctrine, or a tragic accident of timing bought and paid for in blood? The truth is, it was pure, unadulterated luck, and Wade McClusky's Dauntless squadrons were about to cash in the check. Below them lay the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were operating in a loose box formation. Their flight decks were a chaotic, highly combustible nightmare. Admiral Nagumo, the Japanese commander, had been caught in a fatal dilemma. He had originally armed his Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers with high explosive bombs for a second strike on the Midway atoll. But when a scout plane reported spotting an American carrier, Nagumo ordered his deck crews to switch the bombs out for anti-ship torpedoes. In the frantic rush to rearm, the Japanese armorers did not have time to return the bombs to the armored magazines deep within the ship. They simply left them stacked on the hangar deck. Furthermore, the aircraft on the flight deck were fully fueled, with high-octane aviation gas lines snaking everywhere. The Japanese carriers were essentially floating powder kegs. McClusky pushed his nose over and led the Enterprise dive bombers down toward the Kaga. But here, the disorganized nature of American doctrine reared its head again. Standard procedure dictated that the lead squadron should attack the far carrier, while the trailing squadron should attack the near carrier. McClusky, leading the formation, dove on the near carrier, the Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6 right behind him, expected McClusky to bypass the Kaga and head for the flagship Akagi. When Best saw McClusky's entire air group pouring down onto the Kaga, he realized the Akagi was being completely ignored. In a split-second display of brilliant situational awareness, Best aborted his dive, leveled off, and desperately signaled his two wingmen to follow him. While over 30 dive bombers fell upon the Kaga, Richard Best and just 2 other Dauntlesses banked hard and pushed over into a near-vertical dive toward the Akagi. The Kaga disappeared under a barrage of high explosives. At least 4, and possibly 5 1,000-pound bombs smashed into her wooden flight deck. The armor-piercing casings punched through the deck and detonated in the enclosed hangar below. The explosions instantly ignited the fully fueled aircraft and the unsecured ordnance lying on the deck. A massive chain reaction of sympathetic detonations ripped through the ship. Aviation fuel poured into the lower decks, turning the Kaga into an uncontrollable inferno. Hundreds of Japanese sailors and crack mechanics were incinerated in a fraction of a second. Simultaneously, Richard Best was staring through his telescopic sight at the Akagi. He dropped his bomb at an altitude of just 1,500 feet to ensure maximum accuracy. The bomb from his first wingman missed, exploding in the water and sending a geyser into the air. The bomb from his second wingman struck the very edge of the flight deck, causing severe damage, but not a fatal blow. But Best's bomb was a dead center hit. It smashed through the middle elevator and exploded in the upper hangar deck, right amidst the fully fueled and armed torpedo bombers. The blast buckled the flight deck, destroyed the water mains, and started a raging fire that quickly spread to the torpedo warheads. In less than 3 minutes, the flagship of the Kido Butai was doomed. Miles away, the dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, had arrived over the battlefield at the exact same moment. They had lost their fighter escort and their torpedo bombers, but they found the carrier Soryu. Leslie's Dauntlesses pitched over into their dives. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck the Soryu in rapid succession. The results were identical to the Kaga and the Akagi. The bombs penetrated the flight deck, detonating among armed aircraft and fuel lines. The Soryu lost steering control almost immediately, engulfed in a towering pillar of black smoke, her crew abandoning ship as the fires reached the magazines. In the span of exactly 5 minutes, from 10:22 a.m. to 10:27 a.m., the strategic balance of power in the Pacific Ocean had been violently and permanently reversed. The Japanese had spent decades building a naval aviation force of unmatched skill and lethality, and an outdated, slow American dive bomber had just wiped out 75% of it in a single pass. The Dauntless pilots pulled out of their dives, hugging the water, desperately dodging anti-aircraft fire, and the few Japanese Zeros that were scrambling to gain altitude. They looked back and saw 3 towering pyres of black smoke rising into the clear blue sky, marking the graves of the ships that had bombed Pearl Harbor. But the battle was not over. Admiral Yamamoto's grand fleet still had teeth. Out of the smoke and chaos, one Japanese aircraft carrier remained untouched. The Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive and highly capable Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, was sailing a few miles north of the burning wreckage of her sister ships. Yamaguchi did not hesitate. He did not wait for orders from Yamamoto. As the surviving American dive bombers limped back toward their carriers, nursing shot-up engines and empty fuel tanks, Yamaguchi ordered his strike aircraft into the air. The Japanese were bleeding, but they were about to strike back with everything they had left, and their crosshairs were locked directly on the USS Yorktown. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi knew the mathematical reality of naval warfare better than anyone in the Japanese High Command. With 3 carriers burning, the element of surprise was gone, and the American fleet possessed overwhelming numerical superiority in the air. But Yamaguchi was a practitioner of the offensive, a man who believed that a relentless attack could shatter the enemy's psychological will. He ordered 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters into the air, commanded by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, with explicit orders to follow the retreating American strike force back to their flight decks. The target was the USS Yorktown, and the ensuing hours would become a masterclass in the grim science of naval damage control. Radar, a technology the Japanese severely lacked, gave the Americans a crucial edge. At 11:59 a.m., the Yorktown's SECSAM radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike at a distance of 32 miles. This gave the combat air patrol time to intercept. But the Japanese pilots were elite veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. They fought their way through the American F-4F Wildcats and the dense curtain of 5-inch anti-aircraft fire. 3 250-kilogram bombs struck the Yorktown. One punched through the flight deck and detonated in the funnel, severing the uptakes for 3 boilers and filling the engineering spaces with choking black smoke. The ship lost power and went dead in the water. Here we see a fundamental divergence in military doctrine that dictated the outcome of the Pacific War. Japanese damage control was highly centralized, relying on specialized, dedicated teams. When a Japanese ship took a hit, if the damage control officers were killed, the regular sailors often did not know how to operate the fire mains or counter-flood the hull. The American system was entirely decentralized. Every single sailor in the United States Navy, from the cook to the radar operator, was trained as a firefighter. Deep in the bowels of the Yorktown, in temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit, Engineering crews wearing gas masks worked blindly in the dark to bypass ruptured steam lines. Within an hour, they had patched the boilers, and the Yorktown was making 20 knots again. The Japanese scout planes reported they had crippled one carrier, and later, when the second strike arrived, they assumed they were attacking a brand-new, undamaged American flat top. Yamaguchi launched his second wave, 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga. Tomonaga's aircraft had taken a bullet through the left-wing fuel tank during the morning raid on Midway Atoll. He knew he did not have enough fuel to return to the Hiryu. He climbed into his cockpit anyway, knowing it was a one-way trip. This is the lethal dedication of the Japanese aviator in 1942. Tomonaga's flight executed an anvil attack, splitting into two groups to drop their heavy Type 91 torpedoes from both sides of the Yorktown's bow, making it mathematically impossible for the ship to turn out of the way of all the incoming weapons. 2 torpedoes slammed into the port side of the Yorktown, tearing massive holes below the waterline. The ship immediately took on a severe 26-degree list, forcing Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order his men to abandon ship. The Japanese had drawn blood, but they had fundamentally failed to neutralize the American hammer. The USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet were completely untouched. At 3:30 p.m., a mixed strike force of 24 SBD Dauntlesses, including orphans from the crippled Yorktown, launched into the late afternoon sky. They found the Hiryu at 5 p.m. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the Pacific. The Japanese combat air patrol was exhausted, their Zero fighters running low on ammunition and fuel after fighting off attacks all day. The dauntless pilots pushed their noses over one last time. 4 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs struck the Hiryu near the forward elevator. The explosions blew the entire forward half of the flight deck back over the bridge, trapping Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku inside. They chose to go down with their ship, tying themselves to the bridge compass. The Kido Butai, the most terrifying naval armada on the globe, had been completely annihilated in a single afternoon. How does a militarily inferior force, flying obsolete aircraft, achieve such a disproportionate victory? The answer lies in the dual nature of the SBD Dauntless. The acronym SBD stood for Scout Bomber Douglas. Unlike the Japanese, who relied on specialized cruiser float planes for reconnaissance, the Americans used their dive bombers as their primary scouts. This meant that the aircraft searching for the enemy fleet carried a 1,000-pound bomb and could attack the moment they found the target. The Dauntless was not just a weapon. It was an airborne intelligence node. This integrated approach to reconnaissance and strike capability gave the American commanders real-time tactical flexibility. We can compare this integrated scouting capability to the role of Union Cavalry Commander General John Buford at the Battle of Gettysburg. Buford did not just find the Confederate Army. His dismounted cavalrymen used their repeating Spencer rifles to engage and hold the enemy, buying precious time for the main Union infantry to arrive and occupy the high ground. The SBD Dauntless acted in the exact same capacity. It found the enemy, fixed them in place with high explosives, and dictated the terms of the engagement before the Japanese could react. But the true strategic depth of the Battle of Midway is found in the brutal economics of industrial warfare. The Japanese lost 4 heavy carriers, over 300 aircraft, and roughly 3,000 men. But the most devastating loss was the human capital. The mechanics, the armourers, and the veteran pilots who burned to death in the hangar decks of the Akagi and Kaga represented decades of institutional knowledge. The Japanese Karen training program was an artisanal system, designed to produce a handful of elite warriors. It could not rapidly replace mass casualties. This structural flaw mirrors the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. The South possessed brilliant tacticians and highly motivated soldiers, but their agrarian economy could not replace a destroyed locomotive, a ruined cannon, or a fallen veteran. The North, with its massive industrial base in Pennsylvania and New York, could absorb staggering losses and simply outproduce the enemy. The United States in 1942 was the ultimate industrial juggernaut. While the Japanese struggled to build a handful of new carriers over the next 3 years, American shipyards in Brooklyn, Newport News, and Mare Island were laying down the keels for 24 Essex-class fleet carriers and over 100 escort carriers. The United States was fighting a war of mass production, and the SBD Dauntless was the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. It was rugged, easy to manufacture, and forgiving to fly for a 20-year-old farm boy fresh out of flight school in Pensacola. The combat record of the SBD speaks for itself. It was the only American aircraft to fight from the first day of the war at Pearl Harbor to the final days in 1945. It sank more Japanese shipping than any other aircraft in the Allied arsenal. But its most surprising attribute was its lethality in air-to-air combat. Because it was so heavily armoured and armed with twin forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, aggressive Dauntless pilots often turned the tables on the unarmoured Japanese Zeros. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the slow dive bomber became a heavy fighter, utilizing head-on attacks where its sheer structural integrity could absorb hits that would shatter a Japanese airframe. It was a blue-collar machine doing the dirty, unglamorous work of winning a war of attrition. The destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway by a handful of dive bombers fundamentally altered naval doctrine, much like the launch of the HMS Dreadnought in 1906. When the British unveiled the Dreadnought, its all-big gun armament and steam turbine propulsion instantly rendered every other battleship on Earth obsolete. The SBD Dauntless did the same thing to the battleship itself. The massive dreadnoughts of the Pacific Fleet, ships like the USS Pennsylvania and the USS Washington, were suddenly relegated to shore bombardment and anti-aircraft escort duty. The aircraft carrier became the undisputed sovereign of the sea, projecting power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The geometry of naval warfare had expanded from a two-dimensional surface engagement into a three-dimensional chess match, where the most critical real estate was the airspace directly above the fleet. The Battle of Midway was a victory forged by codebreakers, enabled by miraculous logistics, and executed by young men flying an airplane that was outdated the day it rolled off the assembly line. The SBD Dauntless did not win the battle because it was the fastest or the most technologically advanced aircraft in the sky. It won because it was in the right place, at the right time, with the right payload, flown by men who were willing to push their machines past the absolute limits of aerodynamic endurance. It was the heavy, blunt instrument that smashed the myth of Japanese naval invincibility and bought the United States the time it needed to awaken its industrial might. In the ruthless mathematics of war, victory rarely belongs to the perfect weapon. It belongs to the weapon that works when everything else fails. The Dauntless was the right tool for a desperate hour. Now, I want to hear your tactical assessment in the comments below. Which factor do you believe was the most critical to the American victory at Midway? Was it A, the intelligence gathered by the codebreakers at Station Hypo? Was it B, the fatal Japanese decision to rearm their aircraft on the flight deck? Or was it C, the decentralized and highly effective American damage control doctrine? Let me know your choice and your reasoning. And make sure you are subscribed for our next deep dive into the machinery of war.